is yours. All right, thank you so much. I am really happy to be here to share with you uh, the research I'm doing right now and also to engage in this exciting discussion with Joe, Rebecca, and everyone in the audience because I do think this is really something worth talking about. So for the next 15 minutes or so, I will do like I will give some like short introductory remarks on kind of like the on my dissertation slash book project as a whole, and then Joe and Rebecca will offer comments and engagement with it. So my introduction remarks are gonna go through three things. Basically, first, I'd like to talk a little bit about what is my project a work of, or what I think I'm writing about. So it's kind of like how I envision my project. And the second part, the second short part is about what the overarching argument is, just to give you a very kind of like a bird's eye view of what kind of argument I'm making in this project. And thirdly, in kind of like a very broad scope, in very broad strokes, I'm gonna kind of like show you the historical storyline or historical narrative the story I'm telling in this project. So let's start with the first question. What is my project a work of? So I myself see this project as a work of basically three things, right? So first of all, before I started my dissertation research, I developed a quite intense interest in workers' participation in the pro-democracy movements in 1989. And I wrote a couple of articles around 2019 on this, drawing upon existing scholarship, published sources, and the interviews I conducted with the field workers. And of course, then my curiosity naturally extended to the question of what urban industrial workers went through over the decade before 1989 that led workers to participate in 1989 the way they did. So in one sense, my project is really an attempt to document workers' historical experiences in the decade leading to 1989. So this is partly a history of what workers went through, what their lived experiences, especially on the shop floor, looked like. But my project, as I see it, is much more than just a documentation of workers' experiences. It tries to really offer an account of not just labor history, but class politics in China's early post-Mao period. So I try to show how China's ruling elite figure out their way of dealing with urban industrial workers in policy making, and what reactions their policy measures triggered among workers, and how workers' reactions and also elite perception of these reactions in turn shaped subsequent policy making. So this is really a story of the interaction between urban workers on the one hand and the party state on the other hand. And finally, the most ambitious goal of my project is to really offer a new explanation of China's transition from state socialism to capitalism. In other words, I look at how class politics can explain why and how China ended up transitioning to capitalism. So now let's get to the argument. So in the kind of like in the most abstract kind of way, my argument could be put like this. right? The way in which China's urban factory workers interacted with the party state in the late 1970s and throughout the 1980s was a crucial causal ingredient in the making of China's transition to capitalism. Right? So I'm really trying to argue that like class politics, this interaction between workers and party state was a key force driving the way in which China's transition from state socialism to capitalism. And that might sound quite abstract. So let's get let's get at something more specific. So in the late 1970s, China's ruling elite resorted to kind of incipient marketization within the basic parameters of socialism, hoping to resolve the political economic crises they faced at that time. So if you look at what China's policymakers were doing in the late 1970s, it was actually pretty similar to what some East European socialist countries had been doing in the previous decades, particularly Yugoslavia and Hungary. So the policy program here seems to be like building something like market socialism in China. However, the way urban workers interacted with the party state unexpectedly set off one crisis after another, leading to the collapse of China's market socialism, as made evident by what happened in 1989. So the big kind of historical irony here is that even though China's initial turn to marketization was intended to solve crisis, this marketization actually generated more and more crises because of the way in which urban workers interacted with the party state. And these crisis cycles finally culminated in what happened in 1989, and which clearly signaled to China's ruling elite that market economy and the basic parameters of socialism could not coexist anymore. So only in the wake of this collapse of China's market socialism did a full-blown transition to capitalism become an appealing option to China's ruling elite. So that's the overarching argument. So now let me very kind of like briefly sketch out the historical storyline here. So as we all know, in the late 1970s, Chinese socialism was really in very deep crisis, right? And the people across all levels were trying to find ways out. So the post-Mao party leadership attempted to address the deep crisis situation by launching a series of marketization reforms. And when trying to figure out how to model these reforms, many policymakers and intellectuals actually looked to Yugoslavia, which famously combined marketization with workers' self-management. So the late 1970s was a moment when some Yugoslavic-style policy experiments were being tried out in China. But as this fascination with the Yugoslavic model traveled downward to ordinary corners of Chinese society, the Yugoslav influences and the Yugoslavic-style policy experiments actually inspired many Chinese workers to express their own demands for more democracy in their workplaces in new and more emboldened ways. And on top of that, in late 1980, Chinese workers were further emboldened by the outbreak of the Polish Solidarity movement. So the result was a nationwide wave of labor unrest that swept China in the last few months of 1980 and the first half of 1981. So there was really this kind of like inciting effect of what happened in Yugoslavia and Poland that kind of like drove Chinese workers to be more militant at the turn of the decade. And China's ruling elite watched the strike wave unfold in China and was really afraid that what happened in Poland could be repeated in China. So this, for them, became another urgent crisis moment. And therefore, in mid-1981, China's ruling elite adopted a proposal which was put forth by China's official trade union system, which was to partially strengthen the existing institutions of workplace democracy in China's factories, such as the Staff and Workers' Congresses, or SWCs, so as to prevent workers going on strike and the independent union organizing. So the idea is that you strengthen the existing institutions a little bit, and the goal is to prevent workers more kind of like subversive ways of expressing their militancy. So therefore, in the kind of first few years of the 1980s, you get basically what Joe Andreas described in his book as the so-called golden era of the SWC. So in this period, many workers were able to use their power in the SWCs to address the material issues most directly related to their livelihoods. So such as housing, job opportunities for their children, wage and bonuses, working conditions, welfare, so on and so forth. However, for China's ruling elite, workers' democratic practices along these lines committed the error of so-called economism or 经济主义, which means blindly pursuing short-term economic interests at the expense of long-term goals, such as boosting production. And the policymakers further believed that workers' economism was making the state's fiscal crisis even worse because too much economic surplus was going to workers' income rather than state revenue. Therefore, in 1984, the ruling elite launched basically a 180-degree turn to weaken workplace democracy. Specifically, they launched the factory director responsibility system, or 厂长负责制, which really concentrated managerial power into the hands of factory directors. So, unsurprisingly, right, the weakening of workplace democracy greatly increased shop floor tensions between workers and factory managers. And the factory managers face the challenge of how to ease these tensions. So here you get a kind of like an interesting interesting dilemma from the perspective of factory directors. Because on the one hand, factory directors were not willing to give up their powers. And on the other hand, they were still not really allowed to fire those workers who are so-called causing troubles. So what should factory workers really do? What should factory managers really do to ease these tensions between them and the workers and maintain a basic level of industrial peace in this context? It turns out that most factory workers in this period relied on issuing across-the-board pay raises, especially bonus raises, to appease workers, to make workers relatively content. Therefore, in the aggregate, the second half of the 1980s saw workers' monetary income grow in a very chaotic and explosive manner. And such income growth fed into intensifying cycles of inflation through several mechanisms I detail in my work. Therefore, I show that rampant inflation, which was the single most important challenge facing Chinese economy in the late 1980s, was importantly rooted in the policy turn to undermine workplace democracy in 1984 and afterwards. And finally, as existing accounts have well documented, viral inflation was one of the most important sources of grievances motivating energetic popular participation in the pro-democracy movements of 1989. So here we come back in a full circle. To put this storyline together, the early post-Mao era began with profound crises in the late 1970s. And as China's ruling elite tried to find ways out of this crisis, it eventually found itself in an even bigger crisis in 1989, which clearly signaled that China's experiment with market socialism had failed. And the way urban workers interacted with the party state through this entire period had a lot to do with why attempts to solve one crisis repeatedly generated new crises. And here is another way to summarize the storyline. So first of all, as marketization initiated in the late 1970s and early 1980s, workers' bottom-up activism forced the partial democratization of industrial workplaces into the initial policy package of market socialism. Therefore, China's kind of initial configuration of market socialism combined incipient marketization with partial but substantial democratization of public enterprises. But this configuration produced what the ruling elite saw as workers' economism, and this was not something the ruling elite was willing to tolerate in the mid-1980s, given the worsening fiscal crisis. So, as the party state launched policies to undermine and rein in workplace democracy in 1984 and later, China entered a second phase of market socialism, which combined continued marketization with decay of workplace democracy. And this configuration unexpectedly produced rampant inflation, which eventually paved the way for explosive movements in 1989. And as market socialism pretty much collapsed in China in 1989, it was clear to the policy elite that you cannot further marketize while keeping the basic parameters of socialism intact. Therefore, the ruling elite had to choose between two kind of drastic options. Either you stop and reverse marketization, or you go ahead and destroy the basic parameters of socialism and liquidate the socialist working class. And the latter option eventually gained victory after several years of policy debate. But it is very important to keep in mind that this kind of full-blown transition to capitalism in the 90s became a appealing option to China's ruling elite only in this context of the collapse and explosion of market socialism, which was brought about by the way urban workers interacted with the party state. So I guess I will end here, and I'm looking forward to what Joe and Rebecca will say, and also how the audience reacts as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yueran, for summarizing your overarching argument and highlighting also key points of the historical storyline in such a good, succinct manner. Before handing over to our first discussant, Joel Andreas, I would like to remind especially all the other participants and the latecomers of our Zoom rules, specifically about the fact that this session is recorded at the moment, and secondly, I would like to encourage you to post your questions and comments that you might have in the chat. You can do so already now, and Ralph and I will read them out later. And now I'm very happy to give the word to Joel. Joel, the floor is yours.
Okay. Well, thank you to Daniel and to Ralph for inviting me to participate in this very interesting conversation, and especially to Yueran for writing what is a great dissertation and a real contribution to understanding what has happened in China during the 1980s and beyond. I haven't timed my notes, so I don't know how long they'll be. If I go too much over, please stop me. Um, so it's a very impressive dissertation. It's the sharpest analysis, the most sophisticated analysis that I've seen of China's long 1980s. It's going to be a real contribution. And it's especially impressive because Yueran focuses on the relationship between the Chinese Communist Party and the urban industrial working class. This was a key relationship for decades after 1949, even before 1949, but especially after 1949, because the urban industrial working class became the Communist Party's main social base of support after 1949. The party developed close ties with the urban working class and intensively organized workers into work units. It cultivated, based on permanent employment and strong organization, it cultivated the workers politically, and it recruited them for leadership positions. But this was never a peaceful relationship. It was always contentious. And Yueran tells the story of the breakdown, really, of this relationship in the 1980s, as the Communist Party was cultivating another social base, the intellectual elite. The long 1980s were therefore a transition period. It was a transition period, and it ended up being a transition period between socialism and capitalism. It was a transition period between two great upheavals. One was in 1976 with Mao's death and the momentous purge of the radical wing of the party, a purge that extended from the Politburo down to the factory shop floor in every factory. And then between then and 1989 with the Tiananmen protests and the June 4th massacre. The long 1980s were a transition also between two decades that were extremely different politics. The preceding decade, from 1966 to 1976, is now known as the Cultural Revolution decade. It was the last decade of Mao's life. This was the period of the most radical egalitarian policies of the Communist Party's rule. And the party was divided into openly contending factions from the top to the bottom, radical and conservative factions. And so it was a period of intense strife within the party and outside the party, and especially in factories, in every factory. The 1990s, at the end of the long 1980s, was a decade when China decisively moved from socialism to capitalism. And a central part of this transition involved industrial restructuring, which, as Yueran just mentioned, involved the decimation of the urban industrial working class, and certainly the break of the ties between the party and this class, which is no longer an organized class in the same way that it had been. So it's critical that we develop a clear understanding of the long 1980s, and Yueran has provided us with that. It's an excellent dissertation, and I believe it will become an excellent book. The key organizations involved here are the Chinese Communist Party, of course, but also the All China Federation of Trade Unions, the official trade union, and the Staff and Workers Congress. Many scholars have dismissed these organizations, both the union and the Staff and Workers Congress. And if you talk to many workers in China today, they also dismiss these organizations as useless and not important. But they were key links between the party and the industrial workers for decades. They played a central role in the 1950s as the Chinese Communist Party was cultivating this relationship with the urban industrial working class. And then in the 1980s, as this relationship was breaking down, which Yueran narrates. The Staff and Workers Congress were factory congresses of workers' representatives. Today, they're dead formalities, but they were important, lively events, these congresses, in the 1950s and the 1980s. Yueran makes this clear in his account of these meetings in the 1980s. He makes excellent use of a Gramscian theoretical framework in which he analyzes the relationship between the Chinese Communist Party and the working class as hegemonic and moving from hegemonic to despotic. And the concept of passive revolution. The factory organization, the Communist Party's factory organization, along with the Union and the Staff and Workers Congress, were key organizational instruments of this kind of hegemonic domination with relationship between the Communist Party and the working class, which was largely based on this kind of hegemonic relationship until 1989. By a passive revolution, Gramsci and Yueran used this concept to describe that the party was making concessions to the working class, not only economic concessions, but also institutional reforms to maintain this relationship, this hegemonic relationship between the party and the working class, which required making concessions. This was always a contentious relationship, but the Communist Party avoided sharp confrontation by diverting potentially sharp conflicts into institutional channels, mainly the trade unions and the Staff and Workers Congress, where workers could voice their concerns. This had to be an effective forum for workers. Otherwise, it would not be an effective instrument of hegemonic domination. There was a lot of influence during this key period during the 1980s, a lot of influence of Eastern European developments, which Yueran sharply analyzes. There were two key influences. One was the worker self-management model in Yugoslavia, and the other was the strikes organized by workers in Poland, the Solidarity movement starting in 1980. The Yugoslav model represented the path of effective hegemonic domination, I think. And the Polish strike represented the breakdown of this kind of hegemonic domination. What would happen if this domination failed? And both were closely followed by Communist Party leaders as well as workers. Everyone was closely following events in Yugoslavia and in Poland. And Yueran provides an excellent account and interpretation of the relationship here between what was happening in China in the 1980s and what was happening in Yugoslavia and Poland. By the time we get to 1989, however, in Yueran's dissertation, Eastern Europe fades away. We don't hear much about it in 1989. He provides a short and strong account of the 1989 protests. He shows the key role that workers played, which has been underplayed in many accounts, which look mainly at students. It includes this poignant sentence: the specter of democracy, expelled from China's factories, more vehemently reemerged in a few years' time on the streets. And that is exactly what happened. But in Yueran's account, the developments in China and their causes all seem to be endogenous. They all seem to be within China. Eastern European events were actually critically important. What was happening in Eastern Europe, the Yugoslav model was collapsing and leading to an economic and political crisis in the country. By 1989, the rule of all of the communist parties was collapsing throughout Eastern Europe. And the Tiananmen protests were part of the same trend. Only the hegemonic authority of the Communist Party in China was always stronger than it had been in Eastern European countries. And even in 1989, it was much stronger than it was in Eastern Europe. But this was still part of the same global trend. And I would encourage Yueran, when he revises this dissertation to become a book, to really take seriously what was happening in Eastern Europe when he writes about what was happening in China in 1989. The book is based on an amazing array of archival sources. Yueran shows what an amazing resource Chinese archives are. This is the most intensive use that I've seen of archives in counting what happened during the 1980s. And the result is a very solid, well-documented history of this period. You get the inside story of debates within the Communist Party and among the leaders of the Communist Party, and what led to the shifting positions that the Communist Party took, the background of key decisions, the role of key leaders in all of these debates and decisions. This is a fascinating story and one that is a tremendous contribution. But by relying on the archives, which is these were all produced by the Communist Party, he misses the voice of the workers. They are reflected in secondhand accounts in the archives.
It seems that Joel is gone. His connection is off. He was afraid that this might happen. I would suggest we wait a couple of seconds if he's coming back. And if not, I would suggest that we give the word to Rebecca in the meantime, if that's okay for Rebecca. Good.
It's fine for me. Oh, here he is back. Joel, are you there again? Joel, he seemed to have flashed back onto our screens.
No, I think now he went offline entirely to hopefully
to reboot
come
or
to hopefully exactly to come back.
Okay, stronger.
Hopefully.
All right. Well, I mean, I can dive in, but he was in mid-sentence, so sorry, Yueran. We're going to switch topics. But Daniel, is that your determination? Should I
Yes,
jump
I
in here?
would, because I can't
See him.
see him. 1 second.
Okay.
No, he seems to be back. Joel, can you hear us?
I don't see him on the screen, but
Okay,
He
no,
he can come back later, right?
exactly. He can join later and finish his thoughts. So Rebecca, I'm gonna spotlight you, and we're very much looking forward to your comments.
Okay. Well, I'm sorry not to have heard the end of Joel's comments. I was very interested in them, but I'm sure we'll get a chance in a moment when he reboots. But I want to thank Rolf and Daniel for inviting me to participate in this dialogue, a task that demanded that I read Whither Socialism, Workers, Democracy, and the Class Politics of China's Post-Mao Transition to Capitalism. But really, then, I want to hugely congratulate Zhang Yueran for having written such a rigorously researched and deeply theorized piece of work, now called a dissertation, but soon enough, I hope, to become a book. In fact, once the dissertation is done, it is in fact a book. So just call it a book, no longer a dissertation. This is a piece of work that opens a genuinely new perspective and allows for creative new thinking about China, socialism, workers, the 1980s and the 1990s global transition to capitalism. It's been a great pleasure to read and engage with this work, to think through it and with it about one of the most consequential periods in contemporary Chinese and global history. And I see Joel is back. So Joel, do you have much more to say, or shall I continue, or what?
Why don't you continue? And if there's time, I will add my last few points.
Okay.
I'm sorry about that. My internet connection is unstable.
Okay, well then, if you will mute yourself so that we don't get background noise, and I will then continue. Okay, sorry then. Okay, I'll confess from the outset, for those of you who do not know me, that I'm not a sociologist or a social scientist. I'm a historian who tends towards materialist cultural and intellectual history with a healthy interest in the conceptual histories of political economic thinking in China from the 1920s through to the 1990s. And so my engagement with Yueran's work is from the angle of a historian and not necessarily from the discipline of sociology. Before I actually begin, however, I do want to mark that we're moving into the second year of a genocide perpetrated by the Israeli state upon the Palestinian people in Gaza and the West Bank, an ethnic cleansing now being expanded into a war on Lebanon, on Iran, and elsewhere. The contemporary historic bankruptcy of so-called liberal democracies is nowhere more starkly exhibited than in the continued funding and defense of this slaughter, primarily by the United States, but also by Germany, Italy, France, the UK, Canada, and even China. We cannot think about historicity without beginning from our present, from the fraught time of our now when the world is resolving itself into a zombie form. Most clearly, capitalist liberalism is exposed as a naked and undead material and ideological mode of a global project of ethno-nationalist patriarchal militarism. We're living in the final devolution of the United States as a nation and as empire, and the upcoming elections will merely confirm this, even while the residual U.S. imperial form continues its destructive global violence and its funding of destruction under the guise of maintaining so-called world order. We live the emergence of new regional sites of domination, including China, at the same time as the final collapse of the myth of endless resources that challenge us to face the limits and depletions of our natural environments. We live the daily eruption into our lives of racist cruelty, gendered brutality, religio-ethnic hatred, and class oppression, and see that no part of the world, not China, can any longer be considered a space of anti-capitalist outside. We live with and through a China which, in the name of communism, wedded to a virulent nativist nationalism, has become a global capitalist hegemon, the process through which that Yueran helps to track for us. And also it's a global capitalist hegemon with internal penal colonies devoted to the ethnic cleansing and cultural suppression of Uyghurs, Tibetans, and others. We live in a world in which Europe is rushing back to a fascist future, and we live in perpetual war and punishing violence. And yet we also live with hope for radical opposition that continually springs up to remind us that we can form different kinds of social relations based in the multiplicity of our beings and the labors and our lives and labors, the differences in our unity and the unity in our differences. And that's where I really want to thank Daniel and Ralph and so on for continuing to foster that kind of social space where we can discuss works like Yueran's, not obviously as a nostalgic loss, a gesture for a lost past, but to borrow his own characterization, already borrowed from others living in very fraught times, as an imminent critique of our present. And so with that, I'm sorry, I just really needed to remark upon the fact that we're living in a present that is incredibly difficult to think. I wanted to then turn to discussing among the many virtues of Yueran's work is that he refuses to trace a teleological or linear line that gets us from the end of socialism to the onset and development of capitalism in China and its global extension. Indeed, the burden of his theoretical and empirical work is to demonstrate that the long 1980s, from Mao's death until the violent quashing of the worker-student movement in 1989, is characterized by different phases of a process animated by a contingent social and political struggle between industrial workers and a disunified party state, whose form ultimately mutates and coalesces to represent and guide the class politics of an emergent urban ultra-capitalist bourgeoisie and their globe-trotting cosmopolitanism. How did we get from then to now? And since Yueran already recapitulated his narrative moves, I take my task today not to repeat what he said, but to think with and through it. And so I'm going to raise a few questions. And so one of the questions I would pose is how to think the processes that Yueran traces, the materialist economistic struggle between workers and the party state through the 1980s, along with the deeply important intellectual debates then ongoing as well. And I'm thinking of perhaps a deeper engagement with, let's say, Isabella Weber's book, which covers some of the same chronology, albeit very differently, or with some of the debates that let's say Lin Chun and others have raised about the shape of the socialist economy after Mao's death. And there were raging intellectual debates, as you're well aware, I'm sure, about these issues, about how to save socialism from itself, how to transition out of socialism, and so on. None of which were perhaps directly related to the workers' struggle, but all of which were informed and shaped by the ongoing struggles more generally. And so I think it's easy enough to dispense with somebody like Julian Gewirtz, whose engagements are lightweight at best. But I think that Weber's account, Isabella's account, needs to be taken seriously, as does Lin Chun's and Wang Hui's and others. For example, Isabella does deal at length with the Yugoslavia moment in some of its intellectual and policy contours. Now, to be sure, she deals with the raging debates in the 1980s over price and price controls and the ways in which Yugoslavia and Hungary helped shape the move away from a centrally planned economy towards something less centralized. Yueran, your emphasis is on the Yugoslavian model of worker democracy and on the problem of social ownership. I wonder if these are two different stories, or if these stories, or if these are stories that intersect at some point and in some way. Now, I recognize that Isabella is an economist and Yueran, you're a historical or labor sociologist. But I'd like to think that we can transcend our labels, our disciplinary boundaries, and think together. And so while it's clear that Yueran, your focus allows you to trace Yugoslavia down to the grassroots level, where ACTFU cadres engaged with the possibilities of fostering democratic forms in China's factories, thus mobilizing worker enthusiasms for participation. Nevertheless, I'd like to ask, what are the stakes in focusing on social ownership and workplace democracy versus price controls and related forms, in explaining the kinds of class politics that you want to track in the early 1980s transitions? Or rather than, how can we think these together? The one which was relatively ephemeral, the shop floor democracy moment, and the other, which was rather more long-lasting, price controls, ownership, and the eventual sort of opening of the whole thing to the end of the centralized planning and the opening to markets altogether. So a second set of questions revolves around the deployment of the concept of Gramsci's passive revolution. And I know Joel praises you for this, and as do I. I'm really glad to see a certain kind of rigorous theorization enter in the field. I do notice, however, that in your presentation to the audience today, you bypassed altogether your theoretical framework. And so I think it's useful, as you point out in the dissertation, to bypass the expected repression resistance binary. But I am going to ask you about the deployment of passive revolution in your context, and particularly as you put it in conversation with Bourdieu, which represents, to my mind, a certain conceptual inflation that evacuates the theory of its critical edge. Now, this could be a result of our different disciplinary locations, but I'll hope to be non-dogmatic about this. And I'll not enter into how and why a dialogue between Bourdieu and Gramsci would almost inevitably end in a mudslinging. I think Michael Borroway has already written that piece, right, in the early 2000s or 2010s, as I recall. But as we can recall, and I'm not saying that there is only one way to understand Gramsci's passive revolution, but as we recall, Gramsci initially introduces the term passive revolution to think about how mass politics is decapitated to create a passive citizenry. For Gramsci, the passive revolution is the form used by a small, ineffectual political social fraction to impose their will upon a majority. But here in the Chinese case, we have a state industrial form that is far from minority or ineffectual, and that does not want only to dominate, but wishes to actually to lead. This seems to me, and this is where you actually end up with it, it is more like a form of hegemony than a form of passive revolution. And when passive revolution is wedded to Bourdieu, as I said before, a marriage that can only result in domestic violence, it seems, what results is an unstable political social compact that, however, blows up through the 1980s, culminating in the 1989 workers' struggle. And this is, in fact, where you end up. So what does passive revolution do for you here? And more generally then, given that in your presentation just now, your conceptual, I want to ask, are your conceptualizations, are these theorizations actually important for how you shape the narrative of the ensuing chapters of the actually existing democratic struggles engaged by workers on their factory shop floors in the context of the retrenchment of the party-state investment in industry and the attempts by flailing industries to survive in the new economic environment in the early 1980s. In these struggles, as you show, Yueran, the accumulating problems precipitated by externalities find internal resonance in workers' attempts to seize and turn to better democratic effect the emerging enterprise autonomy. Thus, as the economy itself is becoming more economistic, workers too are being bought off by bonuses and livelihood enhancements. Thus, they too are making demands in economistic terms. What then is the relationship of the overall economistic turn in the market, in the environment, and that turn in the factory floor? You contain it rather neatly into the factory floor, but I think there's an external form out there, part of which is has to be informed by the rural reforms, the ways in which the communes have been disbanded and the marketplace is functioning in the rural sphere, as well as the ways in which China has joined the capitalist world economy that helps shape and inform what can and does happen. What kinds of pressures does all of that put on the situation? You seem to extract all of that and focus, and the focus is very nicely done. But for the book, I think you're going to have to open that back out and think a little bit more clearly about what the new transition out of socialism towards a new form of economistic hegemony, now dominated by and through the market rather than otherwise. And so I think that the shop floor struggles are, of course, vastly important, lest we believe that economies move teleologically, or that the state is a monolith capable of both internal unity and the exercise of unquestioned authority. Nevertheless, we also do need, and I think Joel mentioned this, we also have to understand, and I think you do understand this, it just seems to drop out at times, that throughout Mao's time, there were already extant debates within the party that about what the shape of the socialist economy should be, and ultimately about what the definition of socialism itself might be. And these, of course, had become far fiercer with Mao's death. These debates didn't drop out of nowhere, as I'm sure as I know you're aware. And so to just finish with this portion, and then I have one other comment, and then I'm done. Many people in talking about the long 1980s sequence the reforms, right? First rural, then urban. first agrarian, then industrial. And while I don't need you to resequence that or otherwise, I do think some sort of discussion of how what is possible in the urban areas is in fact shaped by what is also going on in the rural areas and China's joining of the global capitalist market. Now, one last question, and I'll be the girl in the conversation here. We know from the aftermath of this long decade that the gendered consequences of urban industrial reform were hugely prejudicial towards women or against women. Is there anything in the 1980s that prepares that way in the processes and struggles that you track? I would be interested to hear. And so in conclusion, I'd just like to reiterate my congratulations on a marvelous piece of work that disentangles complex processes by foregrounding a class struggle of workers to secure the conditions of their labor and lives, however limited their imaginations about that ultimately might have been. In centering class struggle in this process, the class position of the party state will need to be worked out more clearly as well, since clearly the class position of the party state shifts. It no longer speaks on behalf of workers, but it speaks now on behalf of a different class fraction. And yet the work revises substantially what we thought we knew about the early 1980s, as you have already done for the 1989 Tiananmen movement. Your work on the presence of workers there has substantially revised already what we knew about that. And so I look forward to reading a book based in this material that contends with some of the issues and perhaps also that Joel has raised. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Joel, do you want to add something here and finish your comments before giving the word to Yueran?
Yes, if you will allow me. I'm sorry, my internet was unstable and it dropped out. I've got a couple more points to make, and they'll end with questions. One is one of your key points, Yueran, in the dissertation, is that it's not enough to build democracy inside workplaces.
Joe, I think last time we lost you on the methodology point. You haven't finished that yet. If you want to pick up on methodology and then continue with the rest of the point, that would be great.
My main point about methodology I made, that you did a wonderful job of getting some amazing material out of the archives. But we didn't hear much directly from workers, and I guess that's just not what your book will be, which is fine. It just, the voice is missing there. But we hear it secondhand, and that's very weak compared with what it could be. But at any rate, let me get on to these other 2 points, since we want to hear from the folks in the audience too. But your key point, I think throughout the dissertation, but you come back to it in the end, is it's not enough to build democracy inside workplaces. You need workers to be involved in the economy-wide planning as well. And of course, that's true. But in China, even the workplace power of workers was limited and precarious, as you show. And so it would seem to me you have to secure that kind of autonomous power at the base in order to build for stronger. I think we would have to be representative institutions to make decisions at higher levels about big decisions about the economy that would then allow, by participating in this electing representatives and policies, that workers would get more involved and have more of a perspective of the bigger questions, policy questions. But I just wanted to hear more. You brought that in the introduction very briefly. I mean, in the introduction and then in the conclusion, but didn't tell us much about what you foresaw there. Second question is, the introduction is mainly about market socialism, which was what existed in the 1980s. In the conclusion, you bring in democratic planning, and you tell us that if these are alternatives, you're in favor of democratic planning. So not simply that market socialism would be the ultimate goal, for sure. But there seems to be a contradiction. You dwell on market socialism in the first chapter, and then you bring in democratic planning at the very end. it seems that maybe market socialism, you view it as a necessary stage that was simply too short in China. It needed more time to consolidate, and then you could move on to really democratic planning. But the 1980s in China don't give much confidence about that. I think that you're right that the end was not predetermined, and you make a good case for that, that people didn't know in 1980 what the situation was going to be in the 1990s. It wasn't a predetermined path that Deng Xiaoping was taking. But it seems like during the 1980s, as market reforms deepened, China was moving away from socialism and towards capitalism. It wasn't moving away from socialism to some kind of more democratic planning society. Social differences were increasing, beliefs and norms were changing, structures were changing, distinct class interests were being consolidated, inequality was growing. And so, although it was becoming more democratic in some ways, it was not moving towards, but moving away from socialism. So I'm thinking how, if you see this as kind of stages, and this was an open-ended kind of progress or development, how you see these stages working, I guess. So that's it. I look forward to hearing what you have to say in response to all these excellent questions.
Thanks a lot, Joel. And now I would give the word, or we would give the word back to Yueran. Yueran, I would suggest to keep your comments to Rebecca and Joel very brief so that we have enough time for more comments and questions by the other participants.
I really like first of all, I really like to thank Joe and Rebecca for such a careful for such a careful, rigorous and critical engagement with my work, because it's very clear that Joe and Rebecca read the work really carefully, and I think like all the questions are really helpful in terms of like pushing myself to further clarify, to have more conceptual clarity, to kind of like broaden my analytical scope, and also just to simply help me produce a better book. So among all the kind of insightful points raised by Joe and Rebecca, I guess I will just respond to a couple of them. The ones that both kind of like Joe and Rebecca brought up in different ways. So I'm gonna focus on the kind of like the common threads between Joe and Rebecca's comments. I think one thing Joe and Rebecca said in common is kind of like this work, my work has a like kind of like a really a really kind of like solid focus on kind of like how workers and the party state were interacting, especially the enterprise reform policies, but but kind of like at the expense, but kind of like that good focus was achieved at the expense of kind of like a broader analytical scope, right? So like how was the story I'm telling actually situated in a kind of like a broader array of social and political transformations happening at that time. For example, Rebecca especially pushed me to think harder about how my story was related to agricultural and rural reform, and also to intellectual debates at that time. And Joe, on the other hand, especially pushed me to think about how the story what I was telling was related to dynamics beyond China in the late 1980s. How kind of like all the communist countries were entering sharp crisis as a kind of like global trend. So yes, I agree, and I feel that's kind of like something I had already been struggling with, because of course, like a good focus is good for a dissertation, but as I turn it into a book, I definitely really need to think deeper about the kind of like the broader, more kind of like the broader array of factors that were external to my story per se, and how my story were related to these external factors, both inside China and outside of China. But then I guess the kind of like the tricky question for me is how to, on the other hand, broaden this analytical scope, think about how my story was related to these external factors, and on the other hand, still manage to avoid a more kind of like a teleological or linear view of understanding this transition. Because I feel some of the scholarship that has been trying to do that kind of inevitably falls into the pitfall of like teleological history, because it feels like if you are really understanding this transition from socialism to capitalism as a system-wide transition, especially as a global system-wide transition, it seems really hard to escape the conclusion that it's kind of like predetermined and there is no alternative. And I feel like that again plays into this neoliberal myth that there really was no alternative. So I feel that is something I really need to think about harder, like how to broaden the scope without falling into the teleological trap. So, this is one of the points. And then I think on the point about how Eastern Europe was kind of like falling out of my narrative picture, as Joe mentioned, I think here kind of like the big lesson here is that, so like my dissertation tried to talk about this very briefly, but here the idea is kind of like after the mid-1980s, Eastern European socialism became, like for Chinese policymakers, started to become a negative instead of positive lesson, right? So in the late 70s and early 80s, like policymakers were trying to engage with especially the Yugoslavic model to see what they can learn from it. But then after the mid-1980s, after Yugoslavia entered a huge economic crisis, then the dominant concern among Chinese policymakers and intellectuals became how to avoid what Yugoslavia is going through at that time. So it's kind of like really you see this transition from viewing Eastern Europe socialism from a possibly positive and a constitutive lesson into a negative lesson. And that also has a lot to do with the intellectual transformations, especially among the kind of like the newly re-established discipline of economics, which Rebecca brought out through Isabella Weber's work. So yes, that thread was kind of there in my dissertation, but yes, I need to think about how to how to give it a more proper place. Like whether in the book I should highlight that more, or should I kind of like turn that analytical thread into standalone articles, things like that. I'm still kind of thinking about. And then finally, I guess I will respond to one of Rebecca's points towards the very end of her comments, which is the gender consequences of this transformation I was documenting. And here I must say that throughout my dissertation writing process, basically like throughout the entire process, throughout this entire period when I was engaging with these questions, both in my scholarship and also in my political endeavors, my thinking was very much influenced by Yi Dong's work on this period, and I very much see my work as in dialogue with Yi Dong's work, because Yi really carefully analyzed the transformation of care regimes and the transformation of the relationship between the realm of production and the realm of social reproduction in the same period. I'm in the same historical period I'm analyzing. So because I kind of like in dialogue with Yi, I also believe that the decline of workplace democracy in Chinese factories in the 1980s has a very kind of like misogynist effect, basically, because when you had relatively vibrant SWCs or and things like that, then like workers use those channels of democratic participation to demand improvements on welfare provisions, to really kind of like make demands on social reproduction issues. So I do think this relatively short-lived so-called golden era of workplace democracy in the early 80s has a kind of like a gender liberating effect, but that effect was gone after the decline of workplace democracy in the mid 80s. And I think that also was kind of like the foundation was being laid for even a more anti-women workers policy program in the 90s. So I'd really like to acknowledge my intellectual debt to Yige Dong here. Okay, so now I'm done, and I'm looking forward to more engagement with the audience.